Hey guys, let's talk about something you've done thousands of times in your life, but almost never think about until someone mentions it and you suddenly have the urge to do it again. Yawning. Even just reading that word probably nudged your brain a little. Yawn. You might already feel that familiar tingle in your jaw, the impulse to open wide and pull in a long breath. It's one of the most ordinary human actions, and at the same time, one of the weirdest. Why does your body decide, out of nowhere, that it needs to stretch your face, fill your lungs, and water your eyes, sometimes in the middle of a perfectly normal moment? And why is it so strangely contagious, spreading through classrooms, offices, buses, and family dinners like a tiny, silent epidemic? This is part one of the history of yawns, a very contagious timeline. And to understand how we've tried to make sense of yawning, we need to walk through a long corridor of human curiosity. That corridor is lined with old texts, crude anatomical sketches, early laboratory instruments, and finally, the modern technologies that allow us to peek into the brain as it yawns. Yawning isn't just a quirk, it's a mirror of how we've understood the body, the mind, and even the soul across thousands of years. Each new tool, each new theory, each new discovery about the heart, the lungs, the brain, and emotions has reshaped what we think a yawn actually is. Long before there were brain scanners and laboratory studies, there were just people watching other people, animals, and themselves. Our first technology for studying yawns was the oldest one we possess: careful observation. Early humans, without writing or science, lived surrounded by yawns, before hunting, after eating, during long nights around fires. They would have seen children yawning when sleepy, older people yawning when bored, and animals yawning before a fight or after a nap. The pattern was there. Yawns often appeared at the borders between states, between wakefulness and sleep, tension and relaxation, readiness and fatigue. But there was no way yet to measure anything. No pulses, no oxygen levels, no brain waves, just instinct and storytelling. As soon as human societies began recording ideas, yawns started showing up in texts. In the ancient world, where medicine was deeply entangled with philosophy and religion, yawning was often interpreted as a visible sign of invisible forces. In Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, the body was thought to be permeated by spirits, winds, and vital breaths. A sudden, involuntary opening of the mouth was an obvious candidate for cosmic traffic, something entering or leaving the body. Some early cultures even considered yawns slightly dangerous, a moment when harmful spirits could slip in. The covering of the mouth, which many of us still do automatically while yawning, was not always about politeness. For some, it was a protective gesture. When we move into ancient Greece, the story of yawning becomes more tightly woven with early scientific thinking. Greek physicians didn't have microscopes or chemical analysis, but they did have a powerful framework: the theory of humors. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile supposedly shaped temperament and health. Yawning under this system was often seen as the body trying to rebalance itself. Hippocratic texts, attributed to Hippocrates and his followers around the 5th century BCE, suggested that yawning helped remove bad air or vapors from the body, particularly from the brain. Remember, there were no lungs as we know them in that conceptual system, just a body full of fluids and vapors. If you've ever heard someone say that yawning gets rid of bad air, you're hearing an echo from over 2,000 years ago. Greek observers noticed something crucial. Yawning often appeared before fevers broke, before illnesses shifted, or when someone was extremely tired. Without thermometers or blood tests, doctors worked like pattern recognition machines. If yawns showed up around key moments in an illness, then yawning must mean something. Some physicians used yawns as diagnostic clues. An increase in yawning might indicate a coming fever, a shift in the disease, or a weak state of the body. The yawn, in that world, was a kind of primitive medical sign, a visible hint about the invisible inner storm. The Greeks also tied yawning to the environment. In an era when air was considered a major cause of disease, think of miasmas, foul winds, and unhealthy breezes, it made intuitive sense that yawning was the body's attempt to clean or adjust internal air. Without understanding oxygen, they still suspected that air quality affected health and that yawning was a way the body negotiated with the atmosphere. What they lacked in instruments, they compensated with imagination and frameworks that could absorb new observations without collapsing. As Greek ideas flowed into the Roman world, yawning came along for the ride. Roman writers, physicians, and philosophers often echoed Greek explanations but added moral and social layers. Boredom and lethargy, those deeply human experiences, became morally suspicious in a culture that valued discipline and public life. To yawn openly in certain settings could be read as disrespectful or lazy. You can sense the beginning of an idea that still exists today. Yawning not just as a bodily reflex, but as a social signal, something that says you're tired, uninterested, or disengaged. Now, if yawning is so common, why didn't ancient physicians study it more systematically? They kind of did, in their own way, but they were limited by their technology. They had no way to measure internal body temperature, no means to quantify breathing rate precisely, no concept of brain activity in electrical terms. What they did have were basic physical tools, water clocks, sundials, rudimentary scales, and sometimes clever mechanical devices. You can imagine an ancient physician noting that a person yawned repeatedly at certain times of day, but there was no reliable timing device to document this with precision. No stopwatch, no wristwatch, no digital logging, just approximate memory and storytelling. The Middle Ages inherited these ancient ideas and wrapped them in new religious and philosophical fabric. In medieval Europe, yawning sat at the intersection of theology, medicine, and folklore. The Christian concept of sin and temptation added another dimension. Sometimes, a yawn could be read as laziness, one of the deadly sins, or as a sign of spiritual fatigue. At the same time, medieval physicians, still heavily influenced by humoral theory, continued to see yawning as an attempt of the body to expel harmful vapors or adjust humoral balance. The lack of advanced anatomical understanding meant yawns were still working within a fluid-filled, vapor-laden body, not the organ-based, oxygen-dependent system we know today. One of the interesting things about the medieval period is how little practical technology there was to push physiology forward. There were no microscopes, no accurate thermometers, no imaging devices. However, there were advances in timekeeping. Mechanical clocks began to appear in the late Middle Ages, and that shift, though it might sound unrelated, would eventually matter. The more precisely you can measure time, the better you can track cycles, sleep cycles, daily rhythms, pulses, breathing, and yes, the timing of yawns. At first, these clocks served monasteries and cities, not laboratories, but they started training the human mind to think in regular intervals, to notice patterns across hours instead of just vague phases of day and night. Across other parts of the world, yawning was shaped by different medical philosophies. In traditional Chinese medicine, for example, the body was not ruled by humors but by qi, the vital energy flowing through meridians. Although yawning did not take center stage in classical Chinese texts the way some other signs did, it could be associated with fatigue, imbalance of energy, or disruptions in the harmony of the organs. Again, without our modern tools, yawns were interpreted inside the dominant framework: energy flow, organ meridians, and the balance of yin and yang. Similarly, in Ayurvedic medicine in India, yawning served as a sign of shifts in doshas, vata, pitta, kapha, again embedded in a system where the body is a landscape of qualities and energies rather than atoms and molecules. What all these traditions had in common was a near-total lack of precise internal measurement. You couldn't track oxygen saturation. You couldn't measure brain waves. You couldn't even really see fine anatomical structures. Dissection, where it occurred, was limited and often controversial. The technology used to understand yawns was mostly conceptual. Big theoretical maps that tried to explain everything at once, from digestion to emotion to weather. Yawning, as a small but obvious act, became one more piece placed onto these huge, intricate puzzles. The Renaissance changed the human relationship to the body and, indirectly, to yawns. As European scholars rediscovered Greek and Roman texts, they also began dismantling and revising them. Anatomy blossomed. Artists and physicians dissected bodies, sketched organs, and gave flesh and muscle a new clarity. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, for instance, are full of detailed drawings of the jaw, the skull, the throat, and the muscles that expand and contract our faces. To understand yawning mechanically, you first need to understand what moves. The opening of the mouth, the lowering of the jaw, the stretching of the pharynx. All these actions looked different when drawn on a page rather than assumed in a theoretical diagram of humors and vapors. Alongside anatomical advances, new instruments quietly set the stage for future yawning research. Thermometers began to emerge in the 16th and 17th centuries, at first crude and unreliable, then gradually more standardized. For the first time in history, physicians could measure body temperature numerically, not just by touch and impression. Remember that ancient observation about yawning and fevers? Now, in principle, you could test whether people yawned more at specific temperatures, or before fevers rose. It would still take centuries for those experiments to appear, but the tool was there. Another crucial technology that matured in the early modern period was the air pump and related devices used in experiments on gases. Scientists like Robert Boyle began playing with the idea that air was not just an invisible nothing, but a substance with properties, pressure, volume, and eventually, composition. Once people started understanding that air contained something essential to life, what we now call oxygen, the door opened to new interpretations of breathing itself. If air could be broken down and analyzed, maybe breathing and yawning could too. The idea that yawning might be related to oxygen levels in the blood would not fully form until much later, but this was the first hint, a recognition that air was not a spiritual or symbolic thing, but a physical mixture that could be studied, weighed, and altered. By the 18th century, science had grown bolder. The Enlightenment brought an experimental mindset into medicine. Physicians began to quantify things more aggressively: pulse rate, respiratory rate, body temperature, and eventually gas exchange. With these changes, yawning started to look less like a mystical sign and more like a physiological puzzle. Why do we take these unusually deep breaths at specific times? Why do they cluster when we are tired, bored, or transitioning between states? Why are they so annoyingly contagious? However, even as technology improved, yawning remained in the background. It was overshadowed by more urgent questions: infectious disease, circulation of the blood, digestion, childbirth, surgery. You can imagine why. A plague epidemic demanded more attention than the mystery of why people yawn when they're bored at a meeting. But yawns didn't disappear from scientific writings. They were often mentioned in passing, folded into discussions of sleep, fatigue, or emotion. It's just that nobody had yet designed a serious, systematic experimental program centered on yawns alone. The tools were still too primitive, the stakes too low. In the 19th century, medicine and physiology gained powerful new allies: refined microscopes, better chemical analysis, and eventually, the tools of neurology. This century is crucial because it's where we start to glimpse a path from the old body of fluids model to the modern body of systems model. Nerves were dissected, mapped, and electrically stimulated. Muscles were understood as contractile tissues with measurable properties. The brain, once a mysterious organ of thought and soul, began to be described as a physical structure with regions and functions, even if those early mapping attempts were crude. As neurologists and physiologists explored reflexes, yawning slipped into their field of view. Reflexes like blinking, swallowing, sneezing, and coughing attracted attention because they were both involuntary and critical to survival. Yawning, while less obviously useful, shared some features: stereotyped movement, strong urge, difficult to suppress. Researchers began thinking of yawning as a possible reflex tied to breathing centers in the brainstem. The discovery that breathing rhythm was regulated in a specific region of the brainstem, rather than being some vague soul-powered function, was a key step. If the brain had breathing circuits, maybe yawning was a special mode of that system. The 19th century also saw the birth of psychiatry and early psychology. Sleep and dreams became topics of interest, and with them came sleep-related behaviors, including yawning. Doctors documented insomnia, hypersomnia, sleepwalking, and the strange borderlands between waking and sleep. Yawns often appeared in case descriptions: people yawning excessively before seizures, yawning during certain phases of mental illness, or yawning as a side effect of medications. Even if yawning was still not the star of the show, it played a supporting role in this emerging drama of the mind and brain. One more piece of technology entered the stage in the late 19th and early 20th centuries: recording devices. Writing has always been a recording technology, but now sound, and later film, changed how we could observe bodies in motion. Early motion pictures captured everyday actions: walking, running, laughing, stretching, and yes, occasionally yawning. These films allowed scientists to slow down and replay movements that normally pass too quickly to analyze in detail. The yawn, which feels like one continuous action, could be broken down. The initial urge, the opening of the jaw, the inhalation, the peak stretch, the exhale, the relaxation. For the first time, there was the potential to treat yawning as a sequence, not just a blur. It's worth pausing here to notice something important. The history of yawns as a scientific topic closely follows the history of our tools. When we only had philosophy, yawning was explained philosophically. Balance, vapors, humors, energy. When we gained anatomy, it became about muscles and jaws. When we gained thermometers, it could be linked to fever and temperature. When we learned to analyze air, it could be tied to oxygen and carbon dioxide. When we started mapping nerves, it morphed into a reflex controlled by brain centers. At each step, yawns became a little less magical and a little more mechanical, but they never lost their mystery entirely. The other big theme we haven't touched deeply yet, but that was always lurking in the background, is contagion. People have always known that yawning is catching. If you sit in a room with someone who yawns repeatedly, you have to resist or you'll join in. Ancient writers noticed this too. It's not a modern observation. But before neuroscience and psychology, contagion was either just a curiosity or a matter of spirits, energies, or sympathy. One person's yawn might be thought to call out to another's body across some invisible channel. There was no concept yet of mirror neurons, empathy circuits, or social synchrony. In these early eras, the contagion of yawning was probably filed mentally alongside other mysterious spreadings: laughter, panic, enthusiasm, religious ecstasy, and later, even hysteria or mass psychogenic events. Humans influence one another. Behaviors spread. Emotions ripple through groups. Yawning was simply one more example, but uniquely silent and physical. It was like a bodily meme long before we invented that word. The true modern study of yawning, its biology, neurology, and social psychology, would only accelerate in the 20th century, when new technologies like electroencephalography, EEG, brain imaging, and high-speed recording appeared. Those are the tools that really started to peel back the layers of the yawn. Its relationship to sleep stages, brain temperature, arousal, empathy, and social bonding. But those stories belong to later chapters in this timeline. For now, Part 1 leaves us just before the threshold of that modern era, standing in a world that has finally developed enough instruments to tackle yawning as more than a superstition or side note. We've traveled from ancient humors to early anatomy, from mystical vapors to measurable air, from moral suspicion to tentative physiological theories. We've watched mechanical clocks begin to train our minds to think in rhythms, thermometers to think in degrees, microscopes to think in cells, and early neurology to think in circuits. Yawning has been quietly present in all of this, observed, commented on, occasionally recruited as a sign or symptom, but never fully explained. The stage is set. We have tools to measure breathing, blood gases, heart rate, brain structure, and eventually brain function. We have the first attempts to quantify sleep, fatigue, and arousal. We have a slowly forming idea that behavior can be contagious, not in a magical way, but through perception and neural mirroring. The yawn is about to move from a footnote in old medical texts to an object that can be probed, timed, filmed, and dissected in modern laboratories. In the next part of this timeline, we'll step into the 20th century and watch yawns meet machines. EEGs that track brainwaves during sleep and wakefulness, imaging technologies that show which brain regions light up during a yawn, and psychological experiments that test who catches yawns from whom and why. We'll see how technology transformed yawning from a symbol of boredom into a window onto the deepest questions of consciousness, empathy, and the hidden rhythms of our brains. The 20th century opens with yawns still mostly invisible to science. They flicker across faces in lecture halls and factory floors, in barracks and boarding houses, but they are not yet something you can measure. You can't yet attach a number to how sleepy that yawn was, or trace the exact moment a wave of fatigue spreads around a room. What you can do, at first, is listen and watch. Early in the century, clinicians begin to keep more systematic records. With the rise of neurology as a distinct discipline, case reports start to note yawning not just as a nuisance, but as a sign. Certain brain tumors, strokes, or infections appear to bring on bouts of irresistible, repetitive yawns. Patients whose moods swing from high to low, whose endocrine systems are out of balance, whose lungs or heart are failing, may yawn excessively. In these early decades, yawning is a clue, a small, recurring symptom that hints at hidden disturbances in the brainstem, hypothalamus, or autonomic nervous system. But clues are not yet circuits. To find those, technology has to catch up. In the 1920s and 30s, a wave of new instruments enters the laboratory. The polygraph, despite its later reputation as a lie detector, begins its life as a multi-channel recorder of physiology, breathing, pulse, skin conductance. Researchers can now see, on paper, the rise and fall of the chest, the quickening of the heart, the subtle shifts in sweat glands and blood vessels. A yawn becomes not just a facial expression, but a little constellation of curves inked onto a moving strip of paper. A deep inhalation, a brief hold, a long exhalation, shifts in heart rate and skin conductance as the body transitions state. This is also when old ideas about yawning are finally put to experimental test. For centuries, people had believed that we yawn because we need more oxygen or need to get rid of excess carbon dioxide. The story was neat. You're drowsy, your breathing becomes shallow, CO2 builds up, so you yawn to refresh the blood. With gas tanks, masks, and regulators now available, physiologists can manipulate the air people breathe and watch what happens. They do so. They enrich the air with oxygen. They increase carbon dioxide. They alter ventilation rates, measure blood gases, observe and count yawns. If yawning were a simple reflex to oxygen or carbon dioxide levels, it would rise and fall neatly with these manipulations. It doesn't. People yawn in normal air, in oxygen-rich air, in slightly CO2-enriched air. Manipulating gases affects breathing, heart rate, and alertness, but yawns do not obediently track these changes. The oxygen deficit theory, so appealing in its simplicity, begins to crumble. Technological control over the composition of air exposes a misconception that survived on intuition alone. Another instrument is about to change everything far more profoundly: the electroencephalograph, or EEG. In the 1920s, Hans Berger in Germany discovers that tiny electrical fluctuations can be recorded from the human scalp. These brain waves differ when a person is awake, drowsy, or asleep. At first, EEG traces are curiosities, squiggly lines whose relationship to experience is unclear. But by mid-century, they become central to a new kind of research: sleep science. The sleep laboratory is a quintessential 20th century invention. In these darkened rooms, people are wired with electrodes on their scalp, beside their eyes, on their chin. Belts around their chest and abdomen measure breathing. Sensors record leg movements, heart rate, skin temperature. Cameras, first film and later video, watch their bodies through the night. EEG machines hum softly. Ink pens flutter over moving paper. Here, yawning finally meets machines in a systematic way. In the 1950s, Eugene Azarinsky and Nathaniel Kleitman at the University of Chicago identify REM sleep, rapid eye movements accompanying vivid dreaming, by connecting eye muscles to amplifiers and watching the EEG shift into fast, low-voltage activity. Their discoveries reshape our understanding of sleep, but they also bring new attention to transitions: the gentle slope from wakefulness into sleep and the steeper climb back out. These are the times when people yawn most. Sleep researchers begin to catalog what happens in the minutes before sleep onset and just after awakening. They see yawns co-occur with specific EEG patterns: the slowing of alpha rhythms, the emergence of theta waves, the reorganization of cortical activity as the brain lets go of external input and gives itself over to internal cycles, or vice versa. The yawn appears not as a simple air gulp, but as a bodily punctuation mark in the text of consciousness, marking boundaries between states. Technologically, this is a major shift. Yawns now come with timestamps. You can say, "This yawn occurred 30 seconds before the first sustained theta activity," or "Repeated yawns were clustered in the 10 minutes following awakening from slow-wave sleep." What had been a vague association with sleepiness or boredom becomes a pattern embedded in an electrical landscape. Around the same time, more detailed neurological work tightens the link between yawning and specific brain regions. Clinicians notice that damage to certain parts of the brainstem and hypothalamus can either abolish yawning or trigger pathological bouts of it. There are case reports of patients who yawn so frequently that they cannot finish a sentence, and others who seem never to yawn at all. In some stroke survivors, a strange phenomenon appears. When they yawn, an otherwise paralyzed arm briefly lifts and moves, pulled along by the yawn's widespread activation of motor pathways. The involuntary act recruits dormant circuits that voluntary effort cannot touch. All of this points to yawning as a primitive, deeply wired motor program governed by subcortical structures. But it is still mostly about individual bodies. The social, contagious aspect of yawning remains largely unquantified. To get there, scientists need new methods for presenting stimuli and analyzing behavior. They need film, video playback, and later, computers. In the 1960s and 70s, laboratory psychology leans heavily on slides and films. Experiments on emotion, social behavior, and communication often involve showing people short clips and measuring their reactions. Changes in facial expressions, heart rate, or skin conductance. Yawning occasionally shows up as an unwelcome contaminant. Subjects start yawning while they watch, and the researchers worry about boredom biasing their results. A few researchers begin to flip the perspective. What if yawning itself were the subject? The infectiousness of yawning is a folk observation so familiar it's almost invisible. People joke about it in offices and classrooms. "Don't start, you'll set me off." But turning this into an object of study requires thinking carefully about what counts as catching a yawn. Is it enough to yawn within a minute of seeing someone else do it? Do you need to be aware of the other person's yawn? Does hearing it count? What about reading about yawning or just thinking about it? These questions crystallize in the late 20th century, especially through the work of Robert Provine, a neuropsychologist who in the 1980s and 90s begins to treat yawning as a serious topic. To many colleagues, this seems eccentric, even humorous, but Provine is methodical. He designs experiments that use videos of yawning faces, recordings of yawning sounds, and written descriptions of yawns, then measures how often participants yawn in response, and how quickly. Now technology comes into its own as an amplifier of contagion. Instead of relying on one person yawning and hoping others in the room follow, you can project a life-sized face yawning on a screen over and over to dozens of participants while cameras record their reactions. You can replay the same sequence under controlled conditions, eyes open or closed, mouth covered or visible, full face or just the eyes. Provine's studies, and those that follow, establish several key facts. Yawning is indeed contagious for most adults. About half of people will yawn when they see another person yawn, especially if the yawn is vividly displayed. Hearing a yawn can be enough. Reading about yawning may also trigger yawns, though less reliably. The effect is not immediate, but tends to occur within a few minutes of exposure. This might sound obvious, but experimental confirmation matters. It allows researchers to quantify contagion rates, compare conditions, and test populations with different neurological or psychological profiles. Crucially, it opens the door to asking whether contagious yawning is linked to empathy or social understanding. Here, another technological revolution enters the storyline: brain imaging. In the 1990s, PET and then fMRI machines become widely available. These devices can detect changes in blood flow associated with neural activity. You can put a person in a scanner, show them images or play them sounds, and see which parts of their brain light up in response. In social neuroscience, this is transformative. Researchers start tracking which regions are active when people recognize faces, infer others' beliefs, or feel compassion. Yawning soon finds its way into the scanner. To study contagious yawning in an MRI machine, you need stimuli, videos of people yawning, clips of people making neutral expressions, perhaps recordings of other facial movements. You play these to participants while they lie still in the noisy bore of the scanner. You ask them to watch the faces and maybe press a button when they see a yawn, but you also discreetly watch for their own yawns via video or motion sensors, or you measure their urge to yawn. The images that come back show a pattern. Watching someone yawn activates regions involved in processing biological motion and faces, as expected, but also areas associated with empathy, social cognition, and internal simulation. The posterior cingulate, precuneus, medial prefrontal cortex, and parts of the insula. These are some of the same regions that respond when we think about other people's thoughts or feel their pain. At the same time, in monkeys, another discovery is taking shape that will heavily color interpretations of contagious yawning: mirror neurons. In the early 1990s, in Parma, Italy, Giacomo Rizzolatti and colleagues record from neurons in the premotor cortex of macaques. They find cells that fire when a monkey performs an action, like grasping a peanut, but also when the monkey watches another individual perform the same action. This leads to the concept of a mirror neuron system, neural circuits that map observed actions onto one's own motor representations. Soon, people wonder if such a system might exist in humans and whether behaviors like contagious yawning are manifestations of it. After all, a yawn is a stereotyped motor pattern. Seeing someone else perform it might trigger, in your own motor system, a weak echo that sometimes blossoms into a full yawn. Brain imaging studies suggest that watching yawns activates regions analogous to those containing mirror neurons in monkeys, such as parts of premotor cortex and inferior frontal gyrus. The mirror neuron explanation is appealing. Yawning becomes a visible example of our brain's built-in tendency to resonate with others. Yet technology both inspires and constrains this story. fMRI cannot record individual neurons. It sees only broad swaths of activity. So researchers infer mirror processes from patterns of activation, but skeptics point out that similar regions are engaged in many tasks unrelated to action mirroring. The tools illuminate, but also tempt oversimplification. While social neuroscientists debate interpretations, another line of technological research probes the chemistry of yawning. In pharmacology labs, researchers experiment with drugs that tweak neurotransmitter systems: dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, acetylcholine, and various neuropeptides. They inject compounds into animals and watch for yawning. They stimulate or inhibit specific brain nuclei in rodents and primates, using electrodes or targeted infusions, and count how often the animals yawn, stretch, groom, or display sexual or aggressive behaviors. These studies show that yawning is tightly linked to dopaminergic pathways and to a small but important hypothalamic region called the paraventricular nucleus, PVN. Stimulating the PVN can provoke yawning in rats and monkeys. Blocking certain receptors there can diminish it. Dopamine agonists, drugs that enhance dopamine signaling, often increase yawning, as can hormones like oxytocin or adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, and related peptides. Clinical pharmacology echoes this. Patients taking dopaminergic drugs for Parkinson's disease may experience bouts of yawning, especially when doses are adjusted. Certain antidepressants and opioids also list yawning as a side effect. Excessive yawning turns up in case reports as a possible indicator of altered dopamine or serotonin transmission. Technology here means precision, the ability to slice behavior into neurochemical components and link a seemingly simple act to complex molecular cascades. Concurrently, animal behaviorists, armed with better cameras and observational tools, begin documenting yawning across species. High-speed film and later digital video allow detailed analysis of jaw opening, vocal tract shaping, and timing in everything from rats to primates to birds. Zookeepers and field primatologists with portable recorders and increasingly powerful telephoto lenses accumulate vast archives of social interactions. Yawns appear everywhere. Chimpanzees yawn in relaxed settings and during social tension. Baboons and macaques yawn with open mouths that reveal large canine teeth, often in dominance displays. Rats yawn and stretch in transitions between rest and activity. Even fish and reptiles show gaping behaviors that resemble yawns, though their function may differ. Crucially, contagious yawning is documented not just in humans, but also in several other species, especially social primates. Experiments with captive chimpanzees show that they yawn more often when they see other chimps yawn in videos, especially familiar individuals. Later, domestic dogs appear to catch yawns from their human companions, though results across studies are mixed. These findings suggest that contagious yawning may be tied to social and emotional bonds, not just to general arousal. Technology here is double-layered. There are the cameras and monitors in the lab and zoo, and there's also the broader media environment. In the late 20th century, televised nature documentaries bring slow-motion yawns of lions, seals, and monkeys into living rooms. Viewers may find themselves yawning along with a pride of lions at dusk, thousands of miles away. Contagion, once constrained by physical proximity, slips through cables and airwaves. As the century turns, a new technology supercharges this effect: the Internet. Once video streaming becomes common, yawning compilations appear online, montages of people, pets, and wild animals yawning in sequence. Social media makes it trivial to share clips that, by design or accident, induce waves of yawning in viewers around the world. You might start your day watching a stranger's baby yawn on another continent and feel an answering pull in your own jaw moments later. Researchers take advantage of this connectivity. Online experiments recruit participants across cultures and time zones. Subjects watch yawning videos on their home computers while software logs their reactions, or they fill out questionnaires about how often they yawn when seeing others do so, alongside measures of empathy, personality, or social connectedness. Some studies use webcams and automatic facial analysis algorithms to detect yawns without relying on self-report. These methods reveal intriguing patterns. Contagious yawning tends to emerge in children around the age when they also develop more sophisticated forms of social cognition, such as understanding that other people can hold false beliefs. Individuals on the autism spectrum who may process social cues differently often show reduced rates of contagious yawning. People who score higher on certain empathy scales sometimes yawn more in response to others' yawns, though findings are not entirely consistent. Again, technology is both tool and mirror. The same platforms that let scientists run large-scale yawning studies also shape how we encounter yawns in daily life. A yawn on a video conference can ripple through tile after tile of faces, transcending geography but filtered through bandwidth, camera angle, and social norms unique to virtual spaces. Parallel to these social and neurological lines of inquiry, yet another technological current flows through yawning research: the study of thermoregulation. By the early 2000s, some researchers start to question whether yawning's primary function is related not to oxygenation, social bonding, or arousal per se, but to temperature control of the brain. With thermistors, infrared cameras, and precise temperature probes, they measure surface and core temperatures in animals before and after yawns. They manipulate ambient temperatures in controlled chambers and watch how yawning rates change. In some experiments with rats and birds, yawning seems to increase when brain temperature rises and decrease once it falls, suggesting that the big intake of air and the stretching of jaw and facial muscles might help cool nearby blood and cerebrospinal fluid. Infrared imaging in humans hints at subtle changes in facial temperature around yawns. Cooling the forehead or breathing through the nose, which can lower brain temperature slightly, may reduce the urge to yawn, while warming can increase it. The tools for these studies, fine-grained thermal sensors, climate-controlled environments, and software to analyze temperature changes over time, allow a new hypothesis to gain traction. Yawning might be a kind of cranial air conditioning system triggered during state transitions when the brain's temperature regulation needs a quick boost. Contagion, in this view, might still be a social byproduct, but the underlying motor act is framed as a physical maintenance routine. The story is far from settled. Different lines of evidence point in overlapping but not identical directions. Social and empathic factors, thermoregulation, state transitions in sleep and wake, neurochemical shifts. All are implicated to varying degrees. Modern technology complicates as much as it clarifies. More precise measurements reveal how multi-layered yawning is, how many systems it touches. Meanwhile, clinical technology keeps adding new chapters. Advanced MRI, CT, and PET scans show lesions that correlate with pathological yawning, often in the brainstem or diencephalon. Neurologists note that sudden changes in yawning behavior can precede other signs of multiple sclerosis, migraine, or intracranial bleeding. Excessive yawning prior to or during a stroke is documented with greater frequency, turning what was once a trivial complaint into a potential early warning sign. In sleep medicine, overnight polysomnography, the modern descendant of early EEG sleep studies, routinely captures yawns at the edges of sleep. As patients with insomnia, sleep apnea, narcolepsy, or restless legs are monitored in detail. Clinicians no longer treat yawns simply as markers of boredom. They may note their timing relative to apneas, arousals, or medication dosing. Even in anesthesia and surgery, yawning shows up. Patients may yawn as they emerge from anesthesia, a sign of the nervous system rebalancing, or as certain drugs take effect. In psychiatry, yawning appears as a side effect in medication trials and as a curious accompaniment to mood shifts. Case reports describe people whose depression lifts or plunges in tandem with bouts of yawning, suggesting that deep brain circuits governing mood and state transitions are intertwined with yawning networks. Each of these observations is mediated by technology: EEG caps, MRI coils, infusion pumps, digital cameras, wearable sensors, electronic health records. The yawn, which once needed no more than a casual glance to notice, is now surrounded by numbers: degrees Celsius, microvolts, nanomoles per liter, millimeters of blood flow per minute. Underlying all of this is a quiet but profound shift in attitude. In pre-modern times, yawning was enveloped in superstition and metaphor, a soul vulnerable to escape, a sign of laziness or disrespect, an omen. Early modern medicine stripped away some of that, but often relegated yawns to the margins, symptoms at best, annoyances at worst. In the 20th and early 21st centuries, the combination of technology and systematic curiosity rehabilitates the yawn as a legitimate object of inquiry. It becomes a test case for big questions. How do brain and body coordinate transitions between states? How does one nervous system resonate with another? How do simple motor patterns reflect complex neurochemical and social dynamics? What hidden functions might ride on everyday acts we rarely notice? By the time we reach the present, we have EEG traces linking yawns to sleep stages, fMRI maps associating contagious yawning with empathy-related networks, pharmacological profiles connecting yawns to neurotransmitters, thermal images hinting at brain cooling, and digital records of yawns rippling through online communities. We also have unanswered questions, contradictory findings, and debates about interpretation. The yawn, in other words, has become exactly what the tools of modern science favor: a small behavior that opens onto giant mysteries. In the parts that follow, this timeline will leave the laboratory and step more fully into the wild, into classrooms and courtrooms, into primate troops and dog parks, into cultural histories and speculative futures. Technology has revealed yawning as more than a sign of boredom. Now we can ask what it means that such a simple, contagious act is woven so deeply into our biology, our societies, and our shared sense of being awake together in the world. Step out of the scan room and into a lecture hall on a gray weekday morning, and you find a kind of natural experiment that no ethics board would ever approve in a lab. Rows of students sit in semi-darkness, the blue light of a projector flattening their faces. The clock on the back wall advances with audible reluctance. Somewhere in the third row, a mouth opens wide, eyes close, shoulders lift in a small shudder. The yawner's neighbor does not even see it. But 3 seats over, another jaw loosens in sympathy, then another and another still. If you could overlay the room with the analytic tools of the sleep lab, a web of time-stamped video feeds, heart rate monitors, infrared cameras catching the slight flush of warmed faces, you would see a familiar pattern emerge, contagiousness flowing through the group like a wave. The classroom may be the most ordinary stage on which yawns perform, but it neatly concentrates nearly every factor we have learned to suspect: sleep debt, circadian misalignment, mental effort, social context, and the subtle choreography of attention. For decades, teachers treated yawning as a crude barometer of boredom or disrespect. Then came large-scale studies of adolescent sleep, made possible by cheap actigraphy devices and digital sleep diaries, which painted a far more complicated picture. Teens dragged into school at 7:30 a.m. are not misbehaving when they yawn through first-period chemistry. They are colliding with biology. Their internal clocks, shifted later by puberty, are being forcibly marched against the light-dark cycle. When districts push start times back, yawns in early morning classes drop, not because chemistry suddenly becomes riveting, but because the students are less brutally misaligned with their own circadian rhythms. Those same technologies, wrist-worn trackers, online surveys, classroom cameras installed for remote teaching, and quality assurance, have quietly turned schools into inadvertent field sites. Yawns appear more frequently in windowless rooms and in classes scheduled just after lunch, confirming old teacher lore. They spike in the second half of long lectures and decline in sessions that interleave activity with listening. They cluster around exams in peculiar ways, more frequent just before the test, perhaps from anxiety and anticipation, fewer during the first intense burst of problem solving, and then an uptick as mental fatigue sets in. Where a teacher once relied on gut feeling, "I'm losing them," administrators now review archived video and note the moment when heads begin to tilt back and hands fly to mouths. But yawns in classrooms are not just signals of tired brains, they are also signals moving between brains. The student in the front row who is trying not to yawn, the one who clamps his jaw and pinches the bridge of his nose, is doing something visible and meaningful. He is managing impressions in a shared space, wrestling with a reflex that neuroscience tells us is connected to arousal and regulation, while culture tells him it is rude. The contagion of yawning in a class is not just a kind of passive viral spread, it's a negotiation of social presence. Who is allowed to show fatigue? Who must mask it? Which yawns elicit a sympathetic smile from a friend, and which earn a sharp look from the teacher? If you wanted to measure how deeply yawning has woven itself into our ideas of attention and responsibility, you might leave the classroom and enter another ritualized room, the courtroom. Here, the stakes of a yawn are suddenly higher. In the early 21st century, a handful of widely reported cases in the United States and elsewhere brought yawning into legal headlines. A defendant's relative yawned audibly during sentencing. The judge interpreted it as a sign of contempt and ordered the man jailed. A juror's persistent yawning prompted a mistrial in a complex case, the judge explaining that such behavior suggested inattention and disrespect toward proceedings that demanded seriousness. On the face of it, these are straightforward matters of decorum. Courtrooms run on symbols, standing when the judge enters, particular modes of address, strict rules about speaking out of turn. But once researchers began to analyze courtroom dynamics with the same skeptical eye they turned on the lab, those yawning cases took on a different cast. The assumption that a yawn equals boredom, that boredom equals inattention, and that inattention equals injustice, those links are not as solid as they feel. Legal scholars and psychologists, poring over video from trials, noted that yawns often occurred at moments of high tension, during graphic testimony, for instance, or lengthy recitations of legal instructions. Were jurors bored, or were they overloaded, their bodies trying to regulate arousal? The thermal imaging work on brain cooling gave a new lens here. Perhaps a juror yawning in the last hour of a long day was not signaling disdain, but trying, unconsciously, to stay alert. The yawn might be a kind of physiological protest against the structure of the trial itself, a body saying, "You are asking me to concentrate beyond my sustainable limit." Technology complicates these judgments even further. Courthouse security cameras, originally installed for safety, capture everything. The nervous tick of a defendant, the eye rolls of a spectator, the suppressed yawn of a bailiff. As machine learning systems are trained to scan these feeds for threats or unusual behavior, yawns risk becoming data points in opaque algorithms. A system tuned to flag distraction or agitation might treat frequent yawning as a sign of potential disruption. Judges reviewing a playback of their courtroom, already primed by cultural narratives equating yawns with disrespect, might see a pattern where there is only physiology. There is a deeper irony here. Courts regularly hear cases in which the mental state of a defendant is exhumed and scrutinized. What did they intend? What did they know? What could they control? But the mental states of jurors and observers are often flattened into crude categories. A yawn is treated as a moral failure rather than a natural response to stress, monotony, or fatigue. In one sense, this is nothing new. Humans have long moralized the body's involuntary acts. But the combination of surveillance technology and half-digested neuroscientific lore gives those judgments a dangerous sheen of objectivity. A judge who once might have shrugged off a yawn now reinterprets it through a lens of science. The yawner must be bored, and boredom is incompatible with the seriousness of the law. If classrooms and courtrooms dramatize the social reading of yawns, primate troops show us something closer to their deep evolutionary script. Long before infrared cameras and video analysis, field primatologists watched monkeys and apes open their jaws wide and bare their teeth in gestures that look suspiciously like human yawns. At first, such observations were folded into broad, sometimes vague ethograms: wide-mouth display, threat gape, tension display. It was only as recording equipment became smaller and more robust, and as long-term field sites amassed years of footage, that a more nuanced picture emerged. In some species, baboons, macaques, geladas, a yawn is not merely a prelude to sleep. High-ranking males in particular seem to yawn more often during tense social moments, when two subgroups merge, when a predator has been sighted, when mating competition peaks. These yawns often come packaged with other displays: a raised crest of fur, a sideways glance, a hint of canine tooth. An early temptation was to treat such yawns as pure aggression, a kind of slow-motion snarl. But video-based behavioral coding told another story. A male who yawned like this did not always attack. Often, the yawning coincided with group realignment, with lower-ranking animals adjusting their spacing or grooming partners, with conflicts diffused without a bite being exchanged. By aligning yawning episodes with hormone samples, cortisol levels measured non-invasively in feces or saliva, researchers noticed that yawns clustered not just with dominance, but with stress. Following a predator alarm, for example, some primates showed a spike in yawning as the group settled, as if the act were part of a collective calming and resynchronizing. Theories about thermoregulation traveled here too. Imagine a troop huddled after a scare, bodies pressed together, muscles tensed, brains flooded with stress hormones and heat. A few yawns flare open, air cools moist oral tissues, blood returning to the brain sheds a fraction of its warmth. In small increments, the group's arousal level may be nudged down. Contagion appears in the trees as well. In chimpanzee communities, yawns can ripple through a cluster of animals, particularly among individuals who groom each other or share close social bonds. Here, portable video cameras and, later, remotely triggered traps allowed scientists to capture yawning sequences that would have been impossible to document in earlier decades. Some of the same patterns seen in human labs reappeared. Chimps who were more socially central were both more likely to trigger yawns in others and more likely themselves to yawn in response to a partner. Hidden in those simple gestures might be a mechanism for quiet coordination, a troop resting together, a group rising to move, vigilance waxing and waning in synchrony. Even in species where yawns have fierce overtones, male mandrills, for instance, flashing teeth in what looks like unsubtle intimidation, there is an undercurrent of complexity. A yawning male may be broadcasting not just threat, but also his own physiological state, his readiness to act, his level of arousal, his hormonal profile. For conspecifics who have evolved to read such signals, the yawn becomes part of an intricate social calculus. Does one challenge, submit, ignore, or simply copy? What looks to us like a blunt display may, in the perception of another mandrill, be finely graded. If primate yawning hints at the deep roots of our own, dog yawns pull that ancient behavior into our kitchens and living rooms. For many people, their most frequent direct encounter with non-human yawns is not in a documentary, but on the couch beside them. The sight is familiar. A dog hears its human yawn and, a beat later, opens its own jaws in a long, shuddering arc. Pet owners report this often. For a long time, scientists rolled their eyes. Then, someone decided to test it properly. Portable cameras and simple experimental setups made such studies trivially cheap compared to fMRI or EEG research. In one classic design, dogs watched a person, sometimes their owner, sometimes a stranger, either yawn or make another wide-mouthed movement. The sequences were recorded and reviewed frame by frame. The result, replicated in different labs, was clear enough. Many dogs yawned more when exposed to genuine human yawns than to mimicked ones, and more when the yawner was their owner than when it was an unfamiliar person. The effect was not huge, and critics argued about interpretation. Is the dog empathizing or just reacting to a familiar sound pattern? But the possibility of cross-species contagious yawning was no longer so easily dismissed. Technology expanded the question. Instead of performing yawns in person, experimenters played back videos on screens, testing whether dogs would respond to two-dimensional stimuli. Some did. Others seemed indifferent to images, suggesting that scent and subtler cues might matter in real life. Thermal cameras again made a cameo. Dogs who yawned in response to human yawns showed small temperature changes around their eyes, hinting that, as in humans, yawning might help fine-tune arousal. Owners equipped with wearable cameras documented dog-human interactions at home, showing yawns clustering not just around nap times, but during moments of tension, Visitors at the door, raised voices, unexpected noises. Dogs seemed to yawn when we were stressed, perhaps as a kind of appeasement signal or co-regulation effort. A silent, let's all calm down together. Of course, humans have not only observed yawns in dogs, we have co-opted and interpreted them. Dog trainers talk about calming signals, yawns included, that dogs use to diffuse conflict or express discomfort. Online, videos of guilty dogs yawning after chewing shoes go viral, their yawns read as shame. Science is more cautious. These are likely anxiety responses, not moral confessions. Still, the yawn's role as an interspecies social bridge is hard to ignore. To share a yawn with a dog is to feel, however briefly, that a reflex crossing tens of millions of years of evolution still finds an echo between us. If we step back from these specific settings, classroom, courtroom, canopy, couch, a pattern becomes visible. Yawns keep showing up at the edges between sleep and wake, between conflict and calm, between boredom and intense focus, between one species and another. Technology, in the broad sense, has helped us trace those edges more finely. Miniaturized cameras let us capture yawns in nests and dens. High-speed playback lets us dissect the gesture millisecond by millisecond. Wearable sensors give us a map of the body's internal shifts before and after. But as the tools grow more sophisticated, the yawn itself remains disarmingly simple. Open, inhale, close, exhale. Consider workplaces, those regimented ecosystems where attention is literally monetized. Here too, yawns once stood mostly as jokes about boring meetings or images for stock photography. Then, companies began installing cameras in trucks and control rooms to monitor operator fatigue. A driver who yawns too often in a given span might trigger a dashboard alert. A supervisor, watching from afar, might receive a notification that an employee is drowsy. These systems rely on facial recognition algorithms trained on databases of expressions, including yawns. In a sense, the software is doing what our nervous systems have done for ages, detecting an open mouth and inferring a state. Yet, our nervous systems do not send an email to management when they observe a yawn. When software does, those ancient reflexes become grounds for disciplinary action, liability, or intervention. The ethics here are murky. On the one hand, nobody wants a sleepy pilot or a dozing trucker. Yawns can be life-saving warnings. On the other hand, tracking and quantifying such behaviors risks turning every involuntary movement into an item on a performance review. An act that may help regulate alertness, an unconscious attempt by the body to maintain vigilance, gets flagged as a failure of that vigilance. Even away from overt surveillance, digital life reshapes how yawns travel. In online video calls, people now remark on Zoom contagion. One person yawns on screen, dozens of others feel the tug through their webcams. The latency is longer, the cues smaller, but the effect survives compression and pixelation. In streaming culture, reaction videos show creators watching movies or games, yawning in late-night marathons while chat scrolls past with viewers typing, "Now I'm yawning too." Algorithmic feeds, indifferent to the content's physiologic effects, spread videos of babies yawning and cats yawning, a kind of ambient contagion that floats free of any shared physical environment. There is an odd tension here between presence and distance. Contagious yawning has been proposed tentatively as a marker of social connectedness, even empathy. People on the autism spectrum, some studies suggest, show different patterns of contagious yawning, though results are mixed and interpretation is fraught. Psychopathic traits have been weakly associated with reduced yawn contagion. These findings, however tentative, have fed a popular narrative. If you catch yawns easily, perhaps you are more attuned to others. But online, yawning spreads among strangers who will never meet and for whom no mutual attunement exists. A yawn triggered by a looping GIF is not the same as a yawn triggered by a friend's late-night confession in a quiet room. The muscle movement is identical, the meaning diverges. This is one of the central discoveries of the technological age of yawns, though it is not a discovery any one lab could claim. The act itself is a stable pattern of motion and airflow, a reflex honed long before primates stood upright. But what that pattern signifies, what we take it to mean in context, shifts wildly with setting and culture. In a lecture hall, it might mean, "I am tired," "I am bored," or "I am trying courtesy not to be." In a courtroom, it might mean, "I cannot bear the repetition," "I am threatened," or nothing at all. In a macaque troop, it might be a prelude to a fight or a plea for cohesion. In a dog park, it might be a canine way of lowering the emotional temperature after a too rough game of chase. Cameras, sensors, and analytic software have given us finer tools to separate the act from its interpretations, to see where our stories about yawns match the pattern on the ground and where they do not. They reveal, for instance, that yawning in classrooms does not necessarily track boredom. Students in engaging but demanding courses yawn more than those in easy, dull ones as their brains strain against sleep debt. They show that a juror's yawn can arise after hours of intense focus, a sign that the nervous system is fighting to stay within a functional range. They show that a chimp's yawn is as much about who else is nearby and what just happened as it is about the time of day. They also hint at a larger frame in which the yawn is less a signal of state X and more a versatile tool, one that evolution has co-opted for slightly different uses in different lineages. Cooling an overheated brain, stretching muscles in anticipation of movement, regulating transitions between sleep and wake, broadcasting arousal or calm to others, synchronizing group behavior. Yawning may play all these roles in different blends depending on context. No single function fully captures it, and no single setting exhausts its meanings. Perhaps that is why yawning has proved so irresistible as a subject in both serious research and casual speculation. It sits at a crossroads where biology, technology, and culture intersect. The same thermal camera that shows a cooling face in a lab can be turned toward a preacher in a packed church, a musician on stage, or a politician at a midnight filibuster. The same video analysis software used to count yawns in chimps can be run on archival footage of parliaments, classrooms, or protest marches. Each application uncovers another layer of how this small behavior threads through our shared life. As this contagious timeline continues, we will keep following those threads further outward, into the stories people have told about yawns across centuries, the rituals of covering and suppressing them, the superstitions and etiquette that have crystallized around an act nobody chooses. We will also look ahead, toward a future in which our devices might react to our yawns, changing light levels or suggesting breaks, and in which engineers might deliberately harness contagious gestures to coordinate robots or crowds. For now, it is enough to see that the yawn, caught on camera in classrooms and courtrooms, in primate troops and dog parks, is not merely a sign of sleepiness. It is a moving point where individual bodies meet shared environments, where physiology, attention, and social life align for a second in the simple arc of an opening mouth. If yawns mark a point where bodies and environments align, the last century can be read as an attempt to capture that fleeting alignment with instruments. What had been, for thousands of years, a trivial curiosity, noticed, joked about, woven into myths and manners, began to look like a measurable, manipulable event once it entered the field of technology. Glass tubes and smoke drums, film reels and infrared cameras, MRI scanners and machine learning models. One after another, new devices treated the yawn not as an embarrassment to be hidden behind a hand, but as data. The first attempts to quantify yawning looked much like other 19th century physiology: hissing bellows, ticking clocks, inked pens scratching traces across paper. Early respiratory apparatus was designed to measure breath volume and frequency, to separate normal inspirations from sighs, coughs, and gasps. Yawns appeared on these graphs as slow, exaggerated arcs of inhalation, conspicuously larger than ordinary breaths. Scientists tracking breathing under various conditions, fatigue, boredom, exposure to different gases, could not help noticing the occasional towering spike of a yawn, but for a long time they dutifully marked it as an artifact, an annoyance that disturbed the regularity of their curves. As laboratory life grew more routinized, though, yawns became harder to ignore. Long, monotonous experiments produced them. Graduate students taking pulse and respiratory readings from one another during all-night sessions suppressed them. Observers timing attention falters in school children were confronted with waves of open mouths. In notes and footnotes, yawns began to appear as an odd confound, a thing that happened, apparently beyond the will of experimenter or subject, and that needed to be controlled for or explained away. It was the advent of motion capture and cinema that first made the full choreography of a yawn visible in its own right. The same late 19th century techniques used by Edward Muybridge and Etienne Jules Marais to dissect the gait of horses and the flight of birds also captured human faces shifting from composure to gape and back again. In high-speed sequences, researchers could see muscles around the eyes tightening fractionally before the mouth opened. The sequence of jaw drop, tongue flex, head tilt, and eventual closing. What the naked eye registered as a single smooth gesture turned out to have phases, each with its own tempo. Early film audiences found on-screen yawns funny, but also dangerous. Silent comedies quickly discovered that a single character yawning could, if held too long, infect the theater. Not metaphorically, but visibly, as heads began to tilt back and hands rose to faces in the dark. Directors learned to cut away quickly, to use the yawn as a punchline but not linger on it. The new medium thus acted as an amplifier of an old contagion. Never before had hundreds of people, facing the same glowing rectangle, watched a yawn together in close-up. For physicians and psychologists, the cinema offered something more than a gag, a controllable stimulus. A filmed yawn could be shown to one person after another in exactly the same form, at the same speed, while their responses were recorded. By the mid-20th century, psychologists were projecting short films of yawning faces to subjects in dim rooms, noting how long it took before the first spontaneous imitation appeared, how many followed, whether repeated exposure reduced the effect. In those experiments, the yawn became a kind of standardized test, a probe for susceptibility, suggestibility, perhaps even empathy. The real transformation, however, came when yawns were wired into the machinery of sleep research. In the 1930s and 1940s, as electroencephalography, EEG, matured, physicians began to correlate subjective states, sleepiness, alertness, boredom, with patterns of rhythmic brain activity. Yawns, long associated in folklore with fatigue, now became markers that could be synchronized with EEG traces, heart rate monitors, and eye movement recordings. Sleep laboratories, with their tangle of electrodes and dimly lit bedrooms, turned what had been an incidental behavior into a timestamp. The discovery of sleep stages and rapid eye movement, REM, in the 1950s sharpened this picture. Researchers noticed that yawns clustered not in the depths of slow-wave sleep, but around transitions, the moments of settling down at night, the bleary reemergence in the morning, the lulls before and after naps. Over and over, polygraph records showed the same pattern, a shift in the EEG suggesting drowsiness, a change in breathing rate, a slow expansion in thoracic movement, and, on the video feed, the wide gape of a yawn. Where earlier generations had argued about whether yawning was primarily about oxygen intake, these labs saw it as part of the more complex choreography of arousal and state changes, the nervous system's way of sliding from one mode into another. Technological refinements kept adding layers. Thermistors could detect slight changes in nasal airflow, capturing the deep inhalation of a yawn with greater precision than chest belts. Infrared cameras, insensitive to room lighting, recorded sleepy subjects without disturbing them, show the tiny facial adjustments that preceded the main event. Microphones picked up the faint sigh or soft vocalization that often accompanied a yawn, giving researchers another modality to track. Each new instrument rendered the gesture in a different language: electrical potential, temperature, motion, sound, making it possible to see yawns not just as visible expressions, but as multi-system events. Even so, for most of the 20th century, yawning remained a side note. Research on sleep focused on insomnia, narcolepsy, dreams. Research on respiration focused on pathology and sports. Research on emotion focused on smiles, frowns, tears. Yawns fell between categories. They were too ordinary to be a disease, too brief to anchor a disorder, too ambiguous to fit neatly into existing theories of expression. It took a particular convergence of comparative behavior studies, pharmacology, and neuroimaging for yawning to step into the center of the scientific stage. The comparative angle arrived first, with ethologists armed with camcorders and time-coding software watching animals in zoos and field sites. With portable video, it became possible to record hours of continuous behavior in primate troops, wolf packs, flocks of birds, and later to replay those tapes, logging each yawn and the surrounding context. Researchers noticed that, much as in human groups, yawns in chimpanzees, bonobos, and macaques were not evenly scattered in time. They erupted in bursts, spreading rapidly through a cluster of animals sharing the same patch of shade or the same grooming session. Digital timestamps allowed the precise calculation of yawn-to-yawn intervals. Computer programs noted when one animal's yawn occurred within a certain window, say 3 minutes, of another's, and whether these pairings were more frequent than would be expected by chance. They were. Social structure mattered. Higher-ranking individuals' yawns were more likely to trigger followers' yawns. Bonded pairs yawned in tighter synchrony than strangers. This was contagion measured not by casual impression, but by clustered events in spreadsheets and graphs. When similar techniques were turned on domestic animals, dogs in living rooms, horses in stables, the story grew stranger. Experiments using screens to display yawning human faces to pet dogs, while cameras tracked the dog's responses, suggested that yawns crossed species, at least in some cases. Dogs who were strongly attached to their owners, for example, seemed more likely to yawn when their owner yawned than when a stranger did. Again, it was technology, the ability to present controlled stimuli and to document subtle reactions frame by frame that made such cross-species echoes visible. Pharmacology, for its part, came upon yawning sideways. As new drugs for mental health and neurological conditions were tested, clinicians reported an odd side effect. Patients, especially on certain antidepressants and dopaminergic medications, yawned excessively. Sometimes the yawns were simply frequent. Sometimes they were intense enough to cause jaw strain. This pathological yawning, though rarely dangerous in itself, complicated treatment and puzzled physicians. Why should tweaking serotonin or dopamine levels flood the day with yawns? Animal experiments offered clues. When neuroscientists micro-injected minute amounts of specific chemicals into discrete brain regions in rats or monkeys, yawns could be reliably produced. Stimulating the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, a small cluster of neurons deep in the brain, induced waves of yawning and stretching. Oxytocin, dopamine agonists, acetylcholine, delivered to the right spot, they triggered what looked, in rodents, very much like the human act. Block those pathways, and yawning diminished. What had seemed a vague behavior now pointed directly at specific neurochemical circuits. By the time brain imaging technologies matured then, yawning had acquired a kind of map. Certain transmitters, certain nuclei, certain connections down the brainstem and out to face and respiratory muscles. Functional MRI and PET scans layered onto this map the shifting patterns of activity that accompanied actual yawns in human volunteers. Subjects watched videos of yawning faces while lying motionless in a noisy scanner, trying not to move their heads as the urge to imitate crept up on them. By subtracting blood flow patterns from various conditions, seeing yawns, seeing neutral faces, deliberately suppressing yawns, researchers could isolate networks specifically involved in the contagious aspect. Again and again, certain regions lit up. The insula and anterior cingulate cortex, areas involved in interoception and the monitoring of internal states, showed increased activity when subjects both perceived yawns and felt the urge to yawn themselves. Regions in the inferior frontal gyrus and inferior parietal lobule, parts of a system often associated with mirror functions, also engaged, especially when subjects were asked to imagine how the yawning person felt. It was as if the brain were running a simulation. Here is a body doing that thing. Here is what it feels like from inside. Here, perhaps, are the conditions under which I, too, might do it. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, and other forms of non-invasive brain modulation added a further twist. When researchers transiently disrupted activity in some of these frontal regions, people reported a reduced urge to yawn in response to others. When they stimulated parts of the motor cortex linked to facial musculature, they could sometimes provoke fragments of the yawn pattern. A partial jaw opening, a deep breath, a brief sense of almost yawning. These were not everyday clinical procedures. They belonged to small, exploratory studies. But they reinforced the view of yawning as the emergent tip of a coordinated, distributed system, sensory-motor, autonomic, social. By this point, yawning had become useful as a tool. Because it was both robust and easily observable, it could serve as a readout of subtle changes in brain chemistry and connectivity. If a new drug increased yawning frequency, researchers inferred something about its action on specific receptors. If patients with a certain form of dementia no longer yawned contagiously, but still yawned spontaneously when tired, clinicians saw a hint of which networks, empathy-related, socially tuned, were being eroded. In this way, yawns migrated from the realm of folk signs, "you must be bored," to that of biomarkers. Technology, however, was not just probing the brain from the inside. It was also watching our faces and postures from the outside in ever more casual, ubiquitous ways. Cameras that had once been confined to research labs now appeared on dashboards, laptops, and phone bezels. Road safety systems, designed to detect driver drowsiness, trained computer vision algorithms to recognize the slackening of muscles around the eyes, the slow droop of the head, the distinctive geometry of a yawning mouth. Infrared sensors could see in the dark. Pressure sensors in the seat felt micro-shifts in posture. Accelerometers noticed the tiny swerves when a momentary lapse in alertness coincided with a yawn. In aviation and long-haul trucking, such systems promised an extra layer of protection. A camera that saw a string of yawns on a night flight could alert a pilot. A dashboard that noticed a pattern of yawns in a trucker during the post-lunch slump might suggest a rest stop, or even automatically adjust cabin temperature and lighting to promote alertness. In these contexts, the ancient connection between yawning and vigilance was recast in engineering terms. The yawn as early warning signal, a measurable change in state with direct safety implications. The same logic filtered into consumer devices. Prototype smartphone apps used the front-facing camera to monitor users during reading or video calls, quietly tallying blinks and yawns. If they hit some threshold within a given window, the phone might nudge, "Time for a break?" or dim the screen, or remind the user to stand up and stretch. Office wellness programs experimented with webcams that aggregated anonymous indicators of fatigue, among them yawns, to provide managers with dashboards of team energy across the workday. Productivity software flirted with features that would recommend scheduling difficult tasks away from lull periods marked by frequent yawning in one's recent behavior. These ideas, in turn, raised the specter of yawns as a new kind of biometric signal, a micro-gesture that might be harvested and analyzed alongside keystrokes and click rates. If a classroom's cameras could report not only who attended, but how often students yawned during a lecture, would that data be used to improve teaching or to grade attentiveness? If a call center's monitoring software could track yawns as signs of flagging focus, would they trigger algorithmic warnings or countdowns to mandatory micro-breaks? The same technologies that made yawning accessible to careful scientific study also made it legible to institutions interested in optimizing behavior. There is a strange tension here. On one hand, yawns are involuntary, unconscious. They belong to the realm of bodily rhythms we do not choose, heartbeats, shivers, goosebumps. On the other hand, they are visible at the surface, unmistakable, and, as we have seen, socially potent. Technological systems that capture yawns thus straddle two domains. They are reading something intimate, a neural chemical physiological shift, but they are reading it via a public expression. When a sensor flags your fifth yawn in 10 minutes, is it exposing a private state or simply digitizing what everyone in the room could see anyway? Scientific uses of yawning have benefited from this straddling. Online experiments, for example, leverage webcams and crowdsourcing platforms to reach thousands of participants in a way unimaginable for earlier laboratory studies. Volunteers around the world watch short clips of yawning faces on their laptops, consenting to have their own faces recorded while they do. Automated systems detect whether and when they yawn, linking those times to questionnaire data about age, mood, sleep patterns, and social traits. With enough participants, subtle effects emerge. Perhaps some demographic groups are more or less susceptible to contagion. Perhaps individual differences in self-reported empathy correlate with the speed of yawning after exposure. The internet has also changed the ecology of yawns themselves. Videos labeled "Try Not to Yawn Challenge" circulate, daring viewers to resist imitation as a montage of yawning people, pets, and even animated characters unfolds. Comment sections fill with admissions of failure. "I made it 30 seconds, yawned 3 times, got me at the dog." Here, yawning becomes both experiment and entertainment, a deliberate playing with contagion. People test themselves, not unlike volunteers in a lab, but for fun, and their collective responses, millions of views, thousands of comments, provide a crude but real map of how contagious certain stimuli are. Streaming media generally has multiplied exposure. Where once a person might witness a handful of yawns in a day in family or coworkers, now an evening spent online can present dozens in reaction videos, live chats, blooper reels. Yet this increase in exposure does not simply translate into more yawning. People develop strategies, conscious and not, for filtering and regulating. They look away. They distract themselves. They become habituated. Technology, in this way, participates in the arms race between stimulus and response. As one side amplifies, the other adapts. An often overlooked technological actor in the history of yawns is air conditioning. As climate control systems spread through homes, offices, and vehicles, they altered the environmental cues tied to yawning. Earlier theories that linked yawning to thermoregulation had noted that cool air could reduce yawning frequency, while heat seemed to increase it. Modern HVAC systems flatten temperature fluctuations, removing some of the variation that once might have co-produced yawns in crowded, stuffy rooms. At the same time, sealed, recirculated air, low humidity, and artificial lighting introduce new forms of fatigue. The engineered atmospheres in which we now spend most of our time, steady temperatures, low air movement, glowing screens, create constant, subtle demands on our attention. Yawns today often arise not in response to physical environments as such, but to cognitive ones. The unbroken glare of text, the drone of a webinar, the slow drip of notifications. Scientific instruments track this shift. Where earlier studies correlated yawning with oxygen levels or temperature, contemporary ones monitor cognitive load and screen exposure. Eye tracking devices measure micro-movements of the pupil as subjects stare at digital tasks. When yawns punctuate these sessions, they correlate with dips in engagement, not in ambient air quality. Electrodermal sensors strapped to a wrist show subtle decreases in sympathetic arousal before a yawn, as if the nervous system were momentarily letting go of the effort to stay on. In these labs, the yawn becomes a signal of mental rather than purely physiological transition, a punctuation mark in the long sentence of digital work. Technology also offers unusual opportunities to deliberately trigger and harness yawning. Virtual reality developers, for instance, have experimented with embedding yawning avatars in multiplayer environments. Non-player characters who stretch and yawn in a virtual plaza, or other players' avatars whose animations echo their physical movements. In such spaces, a yawn can ripple through digital bodies, whether or not the people behind them are actually yawning. Sometimes the visual illusion alone is enough to provoke the real behavior. Sometimes it is simply a joke. Either way, engineers are beginning to see that contagious gestures like yawns can be tools for synchronizing groups, even in artificial settings. On a more speculative frontier, robotics researchers consider whether simple, highly visible actions modeled on yawns could help coordinate swarms of machines. A robot that periodically performs a conspicuous reset gesture, analogous to a yawn in that it is unnecessary for immediate task performance but signals a change in internal state, might entrain others nearby to similar cycles. In simulations, such shared timing can enhance overall system resilience, preventing all robots from drifting out of phase or exhausting their batteries at once. The contagious yawn, abstracted into code, becomes a mechanism for distributed synchronization. The more yawns are folded into systems of monitoring and control, the more they raise questions about agency. A person caught yawning on camera during a political speech might be read, online, as expressing disdain or boredom, regardless of their actual feelings. A juror who yawns several times during a trial may be taken to be inattentive, possibly affecting legal judgments. When these interpretations are automated, when an algorithm assigns an engagement score to a viewer based partly on yawns, the risk grows that an involuntary reflex will be treated as a meaningful vote. Researchers, to their credit, typically emphasize nuance. Yawns cluster around transitions. They can be induced by empathy, fatigue, boredom, thermoregulation, drug side effects, or neurological disturbance. No single yawn, and often no small cluster, can be cleanly attributed to one cause. Yet the allure of simple metrics in an age of data dashboards is strong. If a sensor can count yawns, someone is bound to ask what that count means and whether it can be optimized. Looking back over the technological history of yawns then, we find a pattern familiar from other aspects of human life. Instruments make the invisible visible, Or, in this case, take what was visible but uninterpreted and give it a set of numbers. Those numbers invite theories, applications, interventions. The yawn, once a private annoyance or a social faux pas, becomes evidence of sleep need, of empathy, of drug action, of attention. Devices that first served scientists spread outward into cars, offices, classrooms, and entertainment platforms, enlisting yawns in projects of safety, efficiency, and engagement. Yet amid all this measurement and manipulation, the basic experience remains stubbornly the same. The slow gathering of an urge you did not call, the widening of the jaw, the stretch down the neck and spine, the brief blink of altered consciousness as the inhale peaks and the exhale drains away. Technology has wrapped this moment in wires and formulas, has replayed it in slow motion, has mapped its correlates deep in the brain. It has projected yawns into theaters and onto phones, has used them as stimuli and as signals, but it has not abolished the small, undeniable fact of the thing itself. If anything, the proliferation of devices has made yawning more conspicuous. We see ourselves yawning in recorded meetings, in video calls, in the mirror-like thumbnails of our own faces on screen. We may mute the microphone or turn off the camera before yielding, not out of politeness in the old sense, but to manage our digital self-presentation. Meanwhile, unseen software may note the timing and frequency of those yawns, adding them to some invisible ledger. The act that once simply happened, shared or hidden in the moment, now often leaves traces. Those traces, taken collectively, amount to a new kind of timeline. Not the mythic chain of yawns stretching back to the first humans, nor the anecdotal "everyone was yawning" of past centuries, but a dense, time-stamped record of when and where people opened their mouths wide in front of sensors. From dash cams on highways to webcams in bedrooms, from MRI logs to classroom analytics, technology has made yawns into events with coordinates. In the next and final part of this history, we can follow that timeline forward into the futures it suggests. If yawns are now measurable, mappable, and manipulable, how might we choose to live with them? Will we design systems that respond to yawns with care, building in rest, adjusting environments, acknowledging limits, or ones that treat them as errors to be eradicated? And what does it mean, in an era of engineered contagion and networked attention, to share a reflex that still leaps, unbidden and sometimes unwanted, from face to face? Imagine a car that knows you are about to yawn before you do. A thin strip of infrared LEDs along the dash monitors the microtremors in the muscles around your jaw, the subtle blink patterns that, in the last decade's worth of driving data sets, reliably precede a yawn by half a second. You are on a familiar highway, late, a little bored, and when you draw breath to stretch your mouth open, the car tightens the steering assist, brightens the dashboard, and lets a cool stream of air down from the vents. The passenger display offers a gentle suggestion. You've yawned 3 times in the last 10 minutes. Would you like to stop soon? You can ignore the message, override the haptic nudge in the wheel, keep going. But the yawn has been detected, interpreted, logged, and responded to. In some insurance plans, it might also be reported. The technical capacity to do this already exists in fragments. Cameras that detect eye closure, algorithms that classify facial expressions with superhuman consistency, wristbands that track micro-movements and heart rate variability. Yawns are just another pattern in the sensorium. The question is not whether we can see them, but what we will choose to make that seeing mean. A history of yawns that has brought us from ancient omens to fMRI sequences now arrives at a new hinge, the shift from describing yawns to designing around them. If yawns can trigger automatic responses, one possible future is a world in which they become recognized signals of legitimate need, prompts for care that don't require you to justify or explain yourself. In a workplace where everyone is already tracked, through calendar logs, keystroke rhythms, VPN connections, and camera feeds, yawns may be framed as one of the few pieces of data that explicitly argue against endless productivity. The office software flags a team whose yawn density has been rising after 3 p.m. An experiment shifts their most cognitively demanding tasks to earlier in the day and shortens afternoon meetings. After a month, error rates drop and turnover slows. The yawns that once embarrassed people in meetings become the basis of a new metric: how effectively an organization respects physiological limits. Schools, too, might reimagine themselves around these embodied signals. Instead of scolding a child who yawns repeatedly in the second period math class, an attentive system could correlate those yawns with late-night device usage, commute length, household noise levels, or even nutritional gaps. A yawn does not themselves diagnose, but once measurable in mass, they point. Rather than a teacher interpreting each open mouth as a little rebellion against the lesson, the network treats them as small data points in a map of circadian mismatch between school schedules and adolescent bodies. Policymakers, faced with a heat map of yawns surging in early morning classes across the district, might finally be forced to confront what pediatric sleep researchers have said for decades. Teenagers are tired because we insist on waking them before their brains are ready. In hospitals and care facilities, yawns already have a foothold as clinical signs, sometimes of oxygen imbalance, sometimes of medication side effects, sometimes of neurological damage. But with cheap sensors, that role could expand. A stroke patient's yawning pattern might be monitored continuously to track brainstem recovery. An elderly dementia patient's sudden increase in yawns could alert staff to possible infection or pain in someone no longer able to articulate discomfort. The yawn's ambiguity, once a scientific frustration, might become a strength in care contexts. One reflex that responds to many insults, a nonverbal signal that something is off. This is the generous vision. A world in which technologies listen to yawns as expressions of embodied limits and shared vulnerability, and respond with better timing, better environments, more humane expectations. It imagines designers who attend closely to the messy biological history of yawning and treat that history as a counterweight to the disembodied fantasies of constant connectivity and infinite focus. But the same properties that make yawns attractive to systems of care, automatic, hard to fake in real time, broadly correlated with states like fatigue and boredom, also make them tempting to systems of management and control. Once a yawn can be captured and scored, it is ready to be optimized or penalized. In a call center of the near future, workers log in at virtual terminals that require their cameras to stay on. An attention analytics platform watches each face, counting blink rates, gaze direction, micro-expressions, and yawns. The sales script is demanding, the calls are long. Over a shift, the system compiles an engagement score that weights many factors, but yawns are a large component. Repeated yawning, the system notes, is correlated with lower upsell rates and higher customer complaint frequency. The company doesn't insist on fewer yawns. It simply reorganizes the schedule. Agents whose engagement scores drop below a certain threshold lose access to premium time slots and bonuses. No one has banned yawning outright. They have just attached consequences to a reflex. Students may experience something similar. Smart classroom systems that once promised to help teachers gauge comprehension now generate individual attentional profiles. A student who yawns through history class not because they stayed up late gaming, but because they are secretly reading ahead and are bored by repetition, will look the same to the camera as one who went hungry and slept poorly. The system cannot differentiate. It only knows that a yawn is a deviation from an idealized model of steady, focused gaze. A teacher, under institutional pressure to keep engagement metrics high, may feel compelled to interpret every yawn as a problem to be solved, a failure of either pedagogy or discipline. One can imagine more intimate forms of control as well. In domestic spaces, the smart TV that pauses when you get up might also track your yawns to infer whether you are losing interest in a show and cue up something more stimulating. Your wearable health device, not content with counting steps and heartbeats, adds a new graph titled Alertness, interpolating from yawns, movement, and light exposure. It offers gentle nudges. You often yawn during your partner's monologues about work. Would you like a reminder to practice active listening? Beneath the veneer of self-help lies a subtle redefinition of what a yawn means. From an ambiguous reflex with social and physiological dimensions to a discrete signal that you are insufficiently engaged. Once yawns become legible to machines, they become legible to institutions. The political theorist James C. Scott famously argued that states seek legibility, simplified, standardized representations of complex social realities that are easier to manage. Birth certificates, surnames, street grids, crop yields. These abstractions enable taxation, conscription, expropriation, and planning. In a fully instrumented environment, yawns are added to that catalog. They are one of the ways that bodies become data, and data becomes policy. From this perspective, yawning looks like a small rebellion, an involuntary microstrike against the demand to pay attention, stay awake, keep performing. The yawn interrupts. It pulls blood and air and muscle into a short choreography of refusal. You cannot answer the phone while you are mid-yawn. You cannot keep your face entirely neutral. Your eyes water, your jaw stretches, your cheeks wrinkle. In most human settings, that brief withdrawal is forgiven or even shared, its contagion a kind of unspoken solidarity among the tired. A world that treats yawns primarily as errors to be corrected risks eroding that solidarity. When you know your yawn may lower your productivity score, you learn to stifle it, to cover your mouth not just out of etiquette, but out of self-protection. When video filters automatically smooth over yawns in corporate conference calls, replacing them in real time with a composited image of your face at rest, something of the tacit social economy of meetings is lost. The visible signs of boredom and exhaustion, which once supplied the friction that forced schedules to be rearranged and workloads to be reconsidered, become flattened out. This does not mean that technologies for detecting or responding to yawns are inherently dystopian. As in so many domains, the social choice lies in the institutional context and the default assumptions. Is a yawn primarily treated as a signal that the environment might need to adjust to the person, or that the person must adjust to the environment? Will yawns be folded into workplace wellness programs that grant more breaks, more flexible hours, and quieter spaces, or into surveillance dashboards that punish deviation from constant vigilance? There is a third possibility, of course, that yawns become a new kind of aesthetic and cultural object in the age of networked attention. Already, yawn compilations on video platforms gather together clips of people and animals mid-yawn, inviting the viewer into the joke and the reflex. In an era where algorithms are tuned to maximize watch time, contagious yawns pose a paradox. They risk making viewers sleepy. But sleepy is not the same as disengaged. A carefully crafted series might choreograph yawns as emotional punctuation, triggering relaxation at the end of a meditation app session, for instance, or marking moments of empathetic resonance in a drama. There are speculative proposals to deliberately harness the contagion of yawns for therapeutic ends. Group therapy sessions in virtual reality could use synchronized yawning as a subtly measurable sign of emotional attunement. When participants yawn in rough unison, their avatars might glow or pulse, reinforcing the experience of connection. Mental health apps might prompt users to watch short sequences of yawning faces before bedtime, harnessing both suggestion and reflex to help them wind down. In these futures, yawns are not merely byproducts of attention gaps, but deliberate tools for shaping states. Advertising will not ignore this. An industry that has already learned to game microseconds of visual salience and auditory surprise will eventually experiment with yawn-triggering imagery. Slow-motion stretches of athletes, close-ups of mouths in soft light, the rhythm of breathing that edges the viewer toward the reflex. The goal would not be to put potential customers to sleep, but to embed the ad in a bodily experience, making it more memorable. Remember that commercial that made us both yawn? Could become a strange new category of brand recall. Beyond the screen, urban planners and architects might begin to think of the yawnscape of a city. Sensors in public spaces would register times of day and locations with high yawn rates, correlating them with lighting, noise, air quality, and traffic patterns. A subway line where riders yawn persistently between two stations could indicate poor ventilation or overly monotonous advertising. A library where readers yawn less than in comparable spaces might be studied for its layout, light, and sound insulation. Yawns become feedback loops not only for individual bodies, but for shared spaces. Yet even as these technological and cultural overlays proliferate, there will remain something irreducible in the experience of yawning. The scientific consensus about why we yawn has grown more sophisticated, but not definitive. Hypotheses about brain thermoregulation, state transition, social bonding, oxygen levels, and arousal all capture part of the phenomenon without exhausting it. The yawn sits at a crossroads of physiology, psychology, and social interaction, too entangled to be fully pinned down. This intractability is, paradoxically, part of the yawn's usefulness as a moral and political concept. In a world that increasingly treats anything that can be measured as something that can be optimized, the yawn resists being turned into a simple knob to be dialed up or down. It can be suppressed by certain drugs, for instance, but doing so often has side effects, disrupted sleep, altered mood, that ripple through a person's life. What looks like a trivial reflex in isolation turns out to be woven deeply into the cycles of rest and activity that sustain us. We might then start to think about yawn rights and yawn ethics, unserious phrases for serious questions. Do people have a right to yawn in public without being flagged as inattentive or suspect by automated systems? Should employers be allowed to use yawn data in performance evaluations? Must platforms that collect yawning data from webcams and wearables disclose what they infer from it and how those inferences are used? These are not questions about yawns alone. They are proxies for our broader struggles over biometric surveillance, workplace autonomy, and the meaning of consent in sensor-rich environments. Consider the possibility of adding yawns to the expanding list of protected biometric characteristics alongside fingerprints and facial geometry. If yawning patterns can be linked, however probabilistically, to health conditions, fatigue levels, or mental states, then collecting and storing those patterns may pose risks similar to those associated with genomic data. A breach of a yawn database might not let an attacker open your phone, but it could inform insurers or employers about your susceptibility to certain conditions or your capacity to endure long shifts without breaks. The fact that this sounds faintly absurd is not an argument against its likelihood. Many of the most intrusive technologies of the last 30 years began as jokes. On the other hand, there is a danger in over-investing yawns with a significance they may not bear. Not every reflex is a moral battleground. A future in which people are anxious about how and when they yawn, worried about sending the wrong signal to algorithms, curating their own reflexes, is hardly liberating. Part of the value of yawning is precisely that it sits below the threshold of deliberate self-presentation. It is something we do without planning, and therefore something that can occasionally surprise us, catching us when we are trying too hard to stay composed, or reminding us that we are tired when we are convinced we must keep going. As yawns become more entangled with technologies of measurement and control, it may be worth consciously cultivating niches where they are allowed to remain opaque. Spaces where cameras are absent, or at least not constantly analyzed. Social norms that treat visible fatigue as a prompt for mutual adjustment rather than for disciplinary action. We might someday need explicit no-tracking zones, not only for conversations or transactions, but for yawns. Some of these niches already exist in informal form. Families that share yawns freely on the couch in the evening, without worrying about how they look. Friendships where a yawn during a long story is read not as insult, but as information, a cue to pause, to shorten, to pick up the thread another day. Religious or meditative communities that understand collective yawns as signs of a group's shifting state, accepting them as part of the practice rather than interruptions. These microcultures of yawning may be fragile, but they demonstrate that not all yawns are treated equally, and that our interpretive choices matter. The history of yawns, looked at through this lens, is not just a story about changing scientific theories or imaging technologies. It is also a story about how cultures handle visible signs of limitation in shared affect. In some periods and settings, yawns have been stigmatized, associated with laziness or disrespect. In others, they have been medicalized, turned into symptoms of underlying disease. In still others, they have been spiritualized, read as the expulsion of demons or negative energy. The rise of sensor-rich technologies and machine learning does not abolish these interpretations. It layers new ones on top. Looking forward, we may see a stratification of yawning futures. For those with means and social capital, yawns may become a luxury, something they can afford to indulge, surrounded by systems that adjust to their needs. Their homes will dim lights and soften sounds when yawns increase. Their cars will gently steer them toward rest stops. Their workplaces will be proud of how often they respond to human signals. For those with fewer resources, yawns will be another vulnerability, another way in which their bodies are made transparent to institutions that seek to extract more labor from them. Their yawns will be counted not to grant respite, but to schedule more training, reposition them to less cognitively demanding tasks, or justify short-term contracts. Between these poles lies the possibility of more consciously designing technologies that treat yawns as signals of mutual dependence, not individual failure. A world in which a commuter train's schedule can be modestly adjusted because its late-night passengers yawn more in winter. Where an online platform throttles the endless scroll not because it fears losing your attention, but because it sees your yawns and offers you an exit. Where your devices learn not just to keep you awake, but to protect your sleep. No timeline is guaranteed. We might instead end up with a muddle of practices, some caring, some punitive, some indifferent, not unlike the past. Yawns will continue to bridge worlds, between humans and other animals, between private bedrooms and public spaces, between ancient rituals and cutting-edge sensors. The contagiousness that once puzzled philosophers and delighted children will now play out across networks and databases, as a single yawn captured on a camera in one room might echo in the statistics of a server farm half a world away. And yet, at the level of lived experience, many yawns will still be what they have always been: sudden, slightly embarrassing, oddly pleasurable openings in the flow of the day. You will still find yourself yawning in the middle of a sentence. You will still look over during a video chat and catch someone else's yawn, feel it tug at your own jaw, and decide, maybe out of politeness, maybe out of solidarity, to yawn back. You will still have those quiet cascades of yawns at bedtime with a partner or a child. The back-and-forth exchange that says, without words, that the day is over. The future history of yawns will be written partly in code and policy, but also in these small moments of shared reflex. The timeline that began, for us, in the fossil record and the earliest written myths will extend into logs and data sets, yes, but also into stories we tell about being tired together, about laughing when a meeting dissolves into a chorus of yawns, about the strange intimacy of seeing someone stretch their face wide open and knowing that somewhere in your own body, a mirror impulse is stirring. Perhaps that is the most contagious aspect of yawns in an age of engineered attention. They remind us that there are still circuits of influence we do not fully control or understand. Even when mediated by screens and algorithms, the sight of another person's yawn can slip past our defenses and pull us into synchronization. It is an invitation not only to rest, but to acknowledge that our bodies are linked, that our capacities rise and fall together. To live with yawns in this future, then, is to accept that some parts of us will always remain inconvenient to systems that demand uninterrupted focus and frictionless productivity. We can choose to treat those parts as glitches to be patched, or as guides to designing a more humane world. The history behind us suggests that we will try both, sometimes in the same breath. The yawns ahead of us, contagious as ever, will keep forcing the issue.